Here's the 1989 Lincoln Town Car ignition switch. And initially I had made a temporary repair to it by putting one cable tie up around the steering column, holding the connector back onto it. But I don't recommend that you do that, because when I was driving it today, I smelled something like burning electrical wiring, and I actually saw a little bit of smoke coming from the steering column. Luckily I was near a hardware store, and I got some more cable ties, and I noticed that this had actually come apart slightly, this white part here. And so I put the cable ties back on it to hold it back together just long enough to get home, and I went to the auto parts store and got a new ignition switch. And this black part here is actually the connector. This white part is actually part of the ignition switch. So you see what the failure mode of it is when I take the cable ties off. This white part was actually coming loose, and it initially caused, when I first got the car, caused it not to crank from the ignition switch. So I've got the new switch, and I've got star bits to take it off. So let me cut the cable ties and we can see what the failure mode was of the ignition switch. Here's the part of the ignition switch that came apart. And you can see there's some evidence of overheating in here. Right there. And it looks like some of this plastic melted here just because of loose contacts on there. So I think that's something that you ought to check if you have one of these cars, just that connection in there is good. Just need to remove the bottom of the ignition, remove the bottom of the steering column. It just screws up in there. And I think I can probably go ahead and put this back on now that it's put back together properly and not coming apart. I think it will probably be okay, but I think eventually I do want to replace this, or perhaps even rewire this system with relays so that there's not high current flowing through the ignition switch. So I'm going to go ahead and put take this off here. I got some star bits, so hopefully I've got the right size that'll take this off. Here's the type of star bit that's needed. It's got a little hole in it because these star screws have got a tamper-proof or pin in it to try to help keep people from hot wiring the car. So now I'm going to take this part off of the steering column. Now the ignition switch has been removed, and there's the activator that connects to the key. Here's the new ignition switch, and this has even got a clamp here to help hold the connector on it. So I think eventually I do want to upgrade to a contactor system, probably thereby removing high current from the ignition switch. But let me see if I can get this one on. This ought to work. I mean, certainly better than it was. Now we've got the new ignition switch installed. I had to take this little piece out of here. This wasn't present on the original, and I thought at first it was something to help keep the connector on, but it wouldn't let the ignition switch move, wouldn't let the switch contactor move. So I took it off, but now it's working good. I think I might just keep the bottom part of the steering column off for a little while, just to make sure there's no more problems. And I may see about getting a new connector for this side of the ignition switch that connects to the wires, just to make sure I have the best contact. But yeah, that was kind of scary because I was smelling something burning, and I thought I saw a little bit of smoke coming up out of here. And I've heard that happen before with Ford ignition switches, so maybe something to check, even if the problem hasn't occurred yet on any of these kind of cars, just for the overheating on the contacts. But I think that this ought to work now.